Hi, this is a talk about how does walking fit into the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, which is affectionately known as the ICF. The ICF is a way of thinking about health conditions. It was the result of considerable debate within the World Health Organization leading up to its endorsement by all 191 member states in 2001. It's the international standard to describe and measure health and disability. It stresses health and functioning rather than disability, and assumes that we can all have some decrement in health and thus all experience some disability. People with disabilities are thus seen on a continuum with the rest of us and not as a specific category. It also tries to provide an alternative to either a medical or social model of disability. In a medical model, disability is seen as a feature of the individual. It needs to be addressed through individual treatment by health professionals. Thus, a limitation in walking ability requires treatment of the individual to give them greater function. In a social model, disability is seen as a socially created problem rather than as an attribute of the individual. It needs to be addressed by challenging or changing society's attitudes and structures. A limitation in walking might thus require the modification of the environment in which the person is moving around, or the provision of a wheelchair. The ICF aims to incorporate elements of both models, and if you want to get technical, it's an example of a biopsychosocial model. This diagram is very widely used and summarizes the model on which the classification system is based. The impact on an individual of a health condition, his or her disorder or disease, is seen as the result of an interaction between health conditions at the top and contextual factors at the bottom. These contextual factors are subdivided. Environmental factors are external to the individual and include social attitudes, architectural characteristics, legal and social structures, as well as climate and terrain. Personal factors, as might be expected, are associated with the individual and include gender, age, coping styles, social background, education, profession, past and current experience, overall behaviour pattern and character. Although prominent in the model, personal factors are not actually classified formally. The health condition and contextual factors both interact at 3 levels. Each level is described positively in the model, but has an associated negative term. Body structures are the anatomical structures within the body, and body functions are the physiological functions of the different body systems, including psychological functions. A problem with a body structure or function, such as a significant deviation or loss, is called an impairment. Activity is a task that an individual executes. The focus here is on the individual as a whole, not just one of their structures or systems. A problem with this is called an activity limitation. Participation is involvement in life situations, how an individual engages with their physical and social environment. A problem with this is called a participation restriction. Although the model is not perceived as hierarchical, the different aspects of the model are seen simply as interacting with each other. The classification system does have a hierarchical structure. It's divided into 2 parts. Within functioning and disability, body functions and structures are separated out so that codes describing function are prefixed by a B and those describing structures by an S. Activity and participation, on the other hand, are grouped together with codes prefixed by the letter D. Following the underlying model, contextual factors are divided into environmental, prefaced by an E, and personal, which, as I've already commented, are not yet specified within the classification. These 5 boxes at this level are called the components. Each component has a number of chapters. These are the chapters for body functions. It's clear that it's primarily B7, neuromuscular and movement related functions, that will be of most concern to us when we consider walking. The chapters for the structures are very similar to those for the functions. And again, it's chapter 7, which is here called movement-related structures, that we're most likely to find material of interest. The chapters for activity and participation, as you might expect, are quite different. And it's chapter 4 on mobility that is most relevant to us. The chapters for environmental factors are quite different again. And as you can see, several of these might have an impact on walking and mobility. But products and technology, E1, and E2, the environment, whether it's natural or human, are the most impactful on walking. Multi-digit codes are listed within each chapter, with each successive digit giving more specific information. Thus, the code for B7302 refers to power of muscles on one side of the body. And the way this works is the 7 relates to general neuromuscular and movement-related functions. That's the chapter of the body functions. The 3 relates to muscle functions within the chapter. The 0 relates to muscle power functions. And the 4 indicates that this refers to muscles on just one side of the body. A similar system of coding operates within the other chapters, and we'll look at it in a little bit more detail in a moment. In order to describe the level of the problem, each code requires a qualifier. These are listed here from no problem, which scores a 0, to complete problem, which scores a 4. The percentage values on the right-hand side are only supposed to be indicative, and the same qualifiers are used for all levels of the classification system. Thus, no problem is between 0 and 5%, whereas a mild problem is between 5 and 24%. If we had the code B7302.2, therefore, this would indicate that the person had a moderate problem with the power of muscles on one side of the body. Within body functions, the most relevant chapter is B7, neuromusculoskeletal and movement-related functions. This is subdivided using the second digit into 3 parts: bone and joint functions, muscle functions, and movement functions. Bone and joint functions are further subdivided into joint mobility, joint stability, and bone mobility. I'm not particularly convinced by this last category and suspect it's a consequence of too many generalists on the WH committee that drew this up. Mobility isn't really a characteristic of bones. Even for the scapular, pelvis, carpal and tarsal bones that are listed within this group, it's essentially the joints that are mobile rather than the bones. It may sound paradoxical, but the main contribution that bones make to movement is their rigidity and geometrical alignment. I can't see this anywhere in the ICF that this can actually be captured. There's a further level of coding depending on the extent of the problem, whether it's a single joint, several joints, or general joint condition. Muscle functions do seem to be reasonably sensibly divided into power, we'd probably refer to strength in clinical biomechanics, tone, and endurance. As with the joints, the next level down refers to the extent of the problem, whether it's a single muscle, several muscles, or a generalized muscle condition. In the final group, we have the movement functions. Whilst the orthopedists seem to have been missed out in defining the roles of bones and joints, the neurologists would appear to have had a field day here. Not only are there 6 categories here, but for many of these, there is a further level of refinement. Involuntary movements, for example, is further subdivided into involuntary characteristics, tremor, tics, stereotypies, whatever they are, other, and unspecified. What is perhaps most important is that the gait pattern is listed as a particular movement function. We'll come back to this a little bit later in the talk. The classification of body structures is quite different in that it is by anatomical region first and then by the structures. Thus, the second digit defines the broad region, the lower extremity, for example, and the third digit defines a more specific segment. And the fourth is the type of structure, whether it is a bone, a joint, a muscle, or a ligament. Note that the joints between segments are included with the most distal segment. So the thigh joint here includes the hip joint here is included in the thigh segment. Within activity and participation, Chapter 4 refers to mobility and is subdivided into 4 sections: changing basic body position, carrying, moving and handling objects, walking and moving around using transportation. The first group includes changing and maintaining body position and transferring oneself. The second group is divided into lifting and carrying, moving with the lower extremity that includes kicking and operating pedals, fine hand use, and grosser hand and arm use. The most relevant group for us, of course, is walking and moving, which includes walking itself, then moving around in different locations, and moving around using equipment. The final group includes using transportation, driving, and riding animals for transportation. All of these are further subdivided. We'll only look at the most relevant subdivisions, which of course are of the walking and moving domain. Within walking and moving, we have distinctions between walking short distances and walking long distances, walking on different surfaces, and walking around obstacles. Moving around reminds us that there's a range of different ways of moving around beyond simply walking. Of course, climbing and running are probably the most relevant to us. It's also important to bear in mind that moving around occurs in different locations, within the home, in buildings outside the home, and outside buildings. Moving around using other equipment isn't further subdivided. Activity and participation are actually described by 2 qualifiers. That's the value that tells us how much or little a person has. The 2 qualifiers are performance and capacity. Performance is what a person does in their actual environment, in their everyday lives, whereas capacity is what the person can do in an idealized environment. A gait analysis laboratory is a good example of an idealized environment. By definition, the performance qualifier, what a person does in their actual environment, should always be greater to or equal than the capacity qualifier, what they are capable of doing in an idealized environment. A code D4501.42, for example, would describe the ability to walk long distances. The 4 would denote a severe limitation in what the patient actually does, whereas the 2 denotes only a moderate limitation in what they're able to do. This might thus describe a child who only has moderate difficulties walking, but isn't allowed out of the house very often because of an anxious parent. Environmental factors are divided into 5 chapters, each with a large number of subdivisions. A detailed review of this is beyond the scope of this particular presentation. Personal factors are not yet explicitly characterized and indeed are generally taken as a catch-all for any factor that can't be regarded as environmental. So, if this is the first time you've been exposed to the ICF, then you're probably a little bit shell-shocked. It does take a little bit of time to get around some of the concepts and to let them settle in, and you might want to review the earlier slides or look at some of the supporting documentation on the ICF website. The beginner's guide is particularly useful. So overall, how useful is the International Classification of Function? The first thing to say is that no one I actually know uses these codes. All the examples in the practical manual come from applications in planning services, systems and policies. In one place, the manual actually warns against applying the classification system to individuals. But then a checklist is available on the website and is clearly intended for use in this context, as it starts with personal identifiers of the individual. The concepts embedded within the classification, however, are really useful, and give us a comprehensive structure for thinking about a health condition and about how it impacts on an individual or group of individuals. It's worth studying the classification just to reinforce the importance of these concepts. In some cases, the content of the classification provides some clarification of the concepts we are dealing with. The structure of the underlying model is also important in the way that it leads us to consider what factors relate to each other. So let's think a little bit about what it can tell us about walking and gait analysis. Within the activity component, we're reminded that walking short distances, as we do in the gait analysis laboratory, is a very small part of our overall walking and moving activity. If we want to think about the patient as a whole, we need to consider the challenges of walking longer distances, of walking on different surfaces, of walking around obstacles. We also need to think about other ways of moving, such as climbing, running, and jumping. We also need to remember that we have to be able to walk around within the home, within buildings outside the home, and of course, outside buildings altogether. And finally, when we talk about moving around using equipment, we have to remember that there are other ways of gaining mobility that don't necessarily require us to use our legs. The classification also reminds us of the importance of performance and capacity in relation to activity and participation. What we are measuring in the gait analysis laboratory is capacity. It's the ability to perform in an idealized environment on a flat, uncluttered surface whilst able to focus fully on the task of walking. What is generally important to individuals is performance, what they do in the real world. Patients, families and health professionals may need to be reminded that what we are measuring is capacity, particularly if the results conflict with their lived experience of performance. The structure also allows us to think about what we're doing in gait analysis. Walking, as we've just been considering it, is seen as an activity. The gait pattern, however, is considered to be a function of the neuromusculoskeletal system. Presumably, we are talking here about the production of a stereotypical cyclic pattern of movement that can move us from one place to the next. This makes it very clear that although the aim of our patient management may be to improve the ability to walk, an activity, the tests we're performing are a documentation of function. Gait analysis is thus very clearly an analysis of function. When we look at the classification system rather than the model, we see that gait analysis, working at the levels of body function, structure and function, is allowing us to explore the interrelationships between those structures and functions. Looking at the relative functions and adding in the relative structures, we see that the classification system helps us to identify all the possible contributors to the gait pattern. There is a problem, though, in that the ICF regards the gait pattern as just another body function amongst all the others. In a conventional gait analysis, we tend to see the gait pattern as a consequence of the level of quality of all the other structures and functions. In this view, the gait pattern is categorically different from all the other structures and functions. From a gait analyst's point of view, this might be a more logical way of considering these factors, with the gait pattern taken as categorically different to the other structures and functions, and as a consequence of them. In this case, the role of gait analysis can be seen as determining which features of the gait pattern are related to specific impairments in body structure and function. Although this is quite a different approach to this intended by the WHO when they conceived the classification, it has perhaps still allowed us to clarify our feeling. It also preserves the work in categorizing the other structures and functions on which gait depends. Let's just restate this formally and define gait analysis as the process of determining which specific features of the gait pattern are a consequence of which particular impairments of body structure and function. This is going to inform this week's learning task, which is in two parts. The first part is to review the literature to try and identify how a patient's walking is affected by the condition, and in particular to identify the significant features of the gait pattern of people with the condition that you've chosen. The second part is to describe how these features are related to specific impairments of body structure and function, which are a consequence of that condition.